What's going on, everybody? Mortem here, this time bringing you a look at Tainted Grail, Fall of Avalon, which should be launching in its early access period right alongside this video. Tainted Grail, The Fall of Avalon is a first-person open-world RPG that sees us in a dark reimagining of Arthurian legends. Though a few things to get out of the way before we dive into that. First and foremost, with this launching right as the game does in early access, that does mean, of course, that the publisher sent me a key a little bit early to take a look at it to bring you this video with. In addition to that, the publisher also shipped me a copy of the board game that this particular game is based off of. If you're unaware, Tainted Grail is a fairly popular board game that has then since led on to other video games as well. But with no further ado and all of that out of the way, let's actually talk about the game itself. So story-wise, what is going to be available is the first chapter of the game, which is roughly 10 to 15 hours long, depending on how much you want to run around, of course, and there are plenty of interesting things to see. Though, while we only have access to this first chapter here, what we're being presented with is about 90% of the core game mechanics, with most of them just lacking a little bit of polish. And over the course of the early access period, they are planning on, of course, polishing those things up, adding a thievery sort of justice system alongside some stealth improvements, though stealth is available, in addition to the ability to dual wield, as well as some improvements to melee combat, which we'll get to here in just a little bit, and also adding in a variety of subsystems such as player housing, gardening, fishing, various little activities like that. And last but not least, they are of course intending to add several of the additional chapters of the game as time goes by. But with what is available to us, we start the game during the prologue, which is a roughly 1 hour segment where we are freed from prison after getting acquainted with some of the core plot beats. So for starters, King Arthur has been dead for around 600 years. The Red Death is returning, a plague that is sweeping the land, causing all sorts of problems, and turning much of the realm of Avalon to a state of despair and disrepair, which has led to a lot of desperate people doing a lot of desperate things, which explains a lot of the experiments we see in the prison we break out of. But on our way out of the prison, we find ourselves in the Weird, met by the Fragment of a Soul, who grants us the ability to slow time even, and asks us, and more so forces us, to go look for the rest of the fragments of their soul. And that, combined with our very mysterious prison break that was facilitated by someone whose employer he will not name, sets up most of our main plot beats. And then we finally get to the mainland, where things kick off in a more proper open world fashion as we track down some of those leads. And while that's as much as I want to talk about in terms of the story, let's talk about some more gameplay focused things. So for starters, there is a character creator, but do remember this is a first person game, so you really only see your character in menus. But nonetheless, there is a relatively limited character creator. I don't know if this will be expanded in the future. And then we are dropped into our prison cell, where we are questioned about what we were doing before being imprisoned, which will set up just a little bit of your starting equipment, if you will, but this choice becomes pretty quickly irrelevant, so I wouldn't worry about it too much. But in terms of builds and what you can do, we gain experience by defeating enemies, of course, but also by leveling up our various skills, which are things like one-handed, magic, sneak, athletics, the usual stuff. Leveling each one of those up will also give you experience, and every time you get enough experience, you level up, and on every level, you gain access to a single attribute point, and then every other level, you earn a skill point, which brings us to the attributes. Now, this part is pretty straightforward. These attributes do more or less what you would expect them to, with spirituality being in place of something like intelligence or your more magic-focused builds, and then practicality being things like crafting and finding extra loot, with the only kind of strange one being that perception is what gives you extra lock-picking chance, which was kind of strange. But every level you'll increase one of these, and then each of these attributes also has a set of various skills that can be purchased with the skill points that you earn. And those particular skills are very hefty in terms of what they actually give you. These are major boons, so every other level you'll be picking something that should be giving you a pretty major benefit. Some of this is just flat stat increases, but some of them are damage increases, passive regen, benefits under certain conditions. For instance, one of them gives you plus 100 armor if your mana is completely full, which could be useful for someone who's focused on melee to pick up, because if they're never using magic, that's just free armor. But there's all sorts of things like that here, so you can kind of get a feel for what the builds will look like and what you can do. Though, with this being a first-person open-world RPG, most of what we're looking at is the classics. We've got stealth or sneak, which will allow us to crouch and surprise our foes. We also have archery, and combined they make the classic stealth archer approach. But we also have two-handed weapons, regular one-handed weapons, magic, of course. There doesn't seem to be any shields in the game, at least not that I've personally found yet, though you can mix and match magic with one-handed weapons, so you are equipping to one hand or the other. And the magic is not something you learn, but rather these are kind of just weapons you find, scrolls out and about, and then you'll equip that scroll to a hand, at which point you'll be able to cast your spells, provided of course you meet the mana requirements. Then we have our regular old equipment, though most of this actually does look pretty cool. They are very good about giving you cool looking armor. Like if you see it on an enemy, chances are they'll drop it. And while your worn equipment does have a weight associated with it, I have not really seen too much in the way of what this affects. I believe it is stamina costs, but certainly something to keep in mind. Though before we move on to combat, there are some attribute related checks. Every once in a while, when you are in conversation with various people, once you get to the sort of main town, where on various side quests or things like that, you can open up some extra options depending on what your actual stats look like. So in addition to affecting your build and play style, they will also grant you some conversational options, it would seem, which for the most part felt pretty good. But moving right along, let's talk a little bit about the combat of this game. Now, for the most part, this plays a lot like Skyrim, to be honest. Though I would say combat in particular is where I could really notice that this was an early access title, as I'm sure you've seen on screen to some degree at this point. And while the models of a lot of the enemies and everything look really good, pretty much all of them are very, very slow, which makes it very easy to kind of just dodge out of the way. And while there is an actual dodge button, normally your just regular old walk speed is enough to sort of back you out of the way of an attack, which makes it very hard for enemies to kill you unless they just have you completely outnumbered. And you combine that pretty significant advantage already with other advantages, like certain magic spells being able to summon various things to fight for you, like a skeleton or a wolf, and also your own ranged options that you have available, and it's pretty easy to get very far ahead in combat until a little later in the game, where you start fighting some enemies that pose a bit more of a threat. On the flip side of that, all the magic, the various weapons available to you, does make it pretty fun to roleplay various builds. Sneaking around and thieving is very much so an option. All sorts of up-close and personal melee combat with heavy armor, but I think the magic really adds some flair to it, because being able to summon up various minions or shoot poison bolts, effectively be a necromancer or a more traditional mage, or some sort of battle mage variant. Here in early access, it seems like they have a lot of builds in mind, and combined with the various skill points, it does make for a pretty engaging experience here in the early days, which I would say is the primary reason I'm excited to see where this particular title goes. But probably the thing I enjoyed about this game the most was simply the atmosphere. There's a very sort of gothic world to explore that is combined with more sinister dark fantasy elements, and I think they did a really good job nailing that, and much of the visuals really do drive that home. And while I don't think they're necessarily spectacular in terms of their graphical quality, a lot of it does still nonetheless look very cool, which makes the game feel like it has a unique setting, even if it is just Arthurian legend. In addition to a world with striking visuals, there's also a lot to explore. There are dungeons to find, optional quests to find in said dungeons, which can lead to you experimenting with things like the alchemy system or the crafting system that is available to ever increase your own power to explore even more dangerous parts of the world. all with a sort of foreboding presence in the background, which is helped along by a lot of the features already being present in the game, such as the full voice acting or the field of view slider that I personally had to mess with a little bit, as the look of this game initially was a bit strange. So a lot of those quality of life features are there, which makes this game, even in early access, feel pretty good to play. However, there is nonetheless still quite a few areas for improvement, as this is indeed an early access title. So for starters, some of the animations in particular are rough around the edges, but there's also things like your followers, if you happen to summon them via magic, really struggling with anything to do with elevation. Trying to get one of those to follow you up a flight of stairs is a real nightmare. I fell through the map once in roughly 5 hours of game time. Occasionally, when I would go to talk to someone, my character would just start spinning in circles for no apparent reason. Some quests are incredibly well marked on your map and tell you basically where to go and what to do, and then other quests give you almost no indication of where something is, who you're supposed to talk to, what to do next. They don't even tell you what direction it's in. So I think there's some stuff there that still needs to be balanced, and that is to say nothing of the combat and the issues I already outlined earlier, with enemies frankly just being too slow to pose much of a threat in anything but extreme numbers. But also other problems like enemies being basically very easy to fool. Oftentimes they'll very quickly forget about you if you're, say, up above them and can just move slightly out of sight for like a second. And enemies often get stuck on terrain, things like that. So make no mistake, there are several issues that absolutely need to be addressed, but in spite of those things, the core of what Tainted Grail is trying to do was very enjoyable for me, and I'm looking forward to seeing how this one shapes up across its early access period, as I will definitely be keeping an eye on it, and when it actually fully releases, I will do a full review for it. But that brings us to the end of the video. Now, I don't know the exact price this game is launching at, though I do know it's not going to be full price. They're going to start off low, and then it's my understanding that as they get closer to release and there's more content added, they'll be upping that price, or at least that was my understanding. Now, I don't know what the initial starting price is, but what would feel good to me personally would probably be around the $30 range, with the acknowledgement that this is early access and what you have access to content-wise is relatively limited. But chances are, with this going live right as the game launches, you probably know more than I do about the price of this game right this moment. But I definitely enjoyed my time with it, and I think it's worth keeping an eye on either way. All of that said, truly, thank you so much for watching. I really do appreciate it. People like yourself watching until the end of this video is what allows me to do what I love for a living, so I can't thank you enough. May you wander in wisdom and have an amazing day.